This is a great comment from Rob that's worth a deeper dive. He highlights an anomaly in that Nephi, right at the beginning of the Book of Mormon, 600 BC, is identifying three witnesses, and then Moroni at the end of the Book of Mormon, about 400 AD, is also identifying three witnesses. This is better explained by the idea that Ether is just a few days before 2nd Nephi is dictated. So in the Mosiah priority, actually they're really close together. But in the historic nature of the text, they're supposed to be 1,000 years apart. One of the really interesting things, I believe, is that Joseph is getting the Book of Mormon text from a rock in a hat. But at exactly the same time, he's getting revelations from God through the same rock in the hat. And there might be some instances where he gets these two things confused. Ether chapter 5 is one of these instances where Moroni is completing the Book of Mormon and the Jaredite record by sealing it up. And this looks like an ending to the Book of Mormon, which doesn't happen because there's more to be produced, so it goes on. But anyway, Ether chapter 5, Moroni addresses Joseph Smith directly. Look at these verses that I've highlighted and read. Therefore, touch them not, in order that ye may translate, for that thing is forbidden you. And then, but then, behold, ye may be privileged, that ye may show the plates unto those who shall assist in bringing forth his work. I think Joseph has got confused, and now he's receiving revelation from Moroni thousands of years earlier, when this really should have been its own little revelation in the Doctrine and Covenants. It's got to be hard to keep the text of the Book of Mormon and the revelations from God separate. Now, there are other instances of the text of the Book of Mormon talking about Joseph Smith directly. We have some in 3rd Nephi with Jesus talking about it, and then again in Mormon chapter 8 with Moroni basically saying that the person that brings us to light will be greatly blessed. But here in Ether chapter 5, we have Moroni actually addressing Joseph Smith directly. And one of the interesting things about this is that it only talks about three witnesses. And this is kind of in line with Doctrine and Covenants section 5, which was received in March of 1829. But the text goes on with 2nd Nephi chapter 11, where Nephi says that God will send other witnesses. And this is reiterated again in chapter 27, where the three witnesses are identified and then other witnesses are also identified. This is happening in real time to a real-time audience. We know this because in Joseph's 1838 history of the church, he gives an understanding that when he got these passages in the Book of Mormon about the three witnesses, that he was teased and pleaded with regard to David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery and also Martin Harris, that they should be these three witnesses. Now, we know from the witness statement there are three witnesses, and then there are 8 witnesses. Now, 8 witnesses are never specified in the Book of Mormon text in relation to those people who will see it. But these passages in 2nd Nephi chapter 11 and also chapter 27 talk about other witnesses that will be able to come forth. And so you can imagine that other people are wanting to be these other witnesses, mainly the Smith and the Whitmer Holmes, who are really close to the translation process. Now, Joseph is probably worried about getting a witness for these 3 witnesses, because that's a hard task. And he's probably confident that he can get something from other witnesses, particularly from his own household of the Smiths or the Whitmers, but he's not entirely sure what that is yet. But we know from the history that he does manage to get a witness from the 8 witnesses, and so this becomes a really big deal. But these 8 are not specified like the 3 are specified in the text of the Book of Mormon, which means that if for some reason that didn't come off and he wasn't able to convince 8 people, particularly his own household and the Whitmers, that he had plates, then he just might not have ever talked about it, and it certainly wouldn't have made its way into the text of the Book of Mormon as a witness. But you can see how complicated things are in the household as the dictation is rolling forward, that the people in the house are responding to the text that is happening in the Book of Mormon and then trying to make it come true. They're also doing this with the commandments and the revelations that are coming forth from the rock in the hat that end up being Doctrine and Covenants sections. They are making little distinction between revelations that are directed specifically at them and things that are coming through the text of the Book of Mormon to them. And bringing it back to the original question, they are not concerned about the idea that three witnesses is talked about in Ether, and just a few days later it's talked about again by Nephi, even though Nephi's 1,000 years earlier. Because to the household, it's all miraculous, and they're just excited to be a part of it. Let's talk a little bit more about Ether chapter 5, because there are some great oddities worth exploring. Now, I've just talked in my last video that Moroni in Ether chapter 5, as he's finishing the record of the Jaredites, a very brief record at this point, is that Moroni talks to Joseph Smith directly and tells him that he's now allowed to show three people the plates so that they can bring forth this great work. Now, Ether chapter 5 is just a few verses, but what is really curious is that you can line it up right next to the testimony of the three witnesses, and you can see that these two things are related. When you do a side-by-side, you can see that many of the phrases that are in Ether chapter 5 are utilized in the testimony of the three witnesses to give it its body. Now, while the text is about the three witnesses in both Ether chapter 5 and, of course, the testimony of the three witnesses, when you read these two passages, you don't get a sense that they are built on the same structure. But they're the same kinds of things we've seen throughout the Book of Mormon, and that is the idea that it's a repeated story. The structure has been memorized and then repeated in a completely unique way to obscure the fact that there is some composition. And of course, this means that whoever dictated the testimony of the three witnesses as a thing that they should sign was also the same person who dictated Ether chapter 5, which, going with our earlier examples, suggests that this is Joseph Smith. No wonder that Joseph can produce at a rate that he is producing, because he's basically using narrative outlines and then repeating them in order to get the speed of dictation that allows him to get through the text. And you've got to think that this must seem so miraculous to the people of the household, because this is just rolling off his tongue with little or no effort. It's completely explainable why the witnesses are just so motivated to be the witnesses. And when Joseph introduces this text in Ether chapter 5, why Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris all petition and press him that they will be the ones to be these witnesses, and they count it as a huge privilege. I want to revisit Oliver Cowdery's Articles and Covenants that was produced in June of 1829, because I think there's some really interesting things that correlate here with what we're talking about with regard to Ether chapter 5. Once Joseph and Oliver are at the Fayette farm in New York with the Whitmers, they experience something a little different, and that is probably a little elevation of their whole project. In Harmony, Pennsylvania, they're not liked by Emma's family, and by the end of May 1829, they have to, in a rush, flee Harmony for Fayette when David Whitmer comes and rescues them. But in the Whitmer household, they are stars. They have been converted by Oliver's letters, and now they're excited about the work. Along with the idea that David is going to be one of the three witnesses, and perhaps the other Whitmer brothers are going to be part of another set of witnesses that end up being the 8 witnesses, Joseph gets a revelation for Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer that they are going to establish a church. We've had a whole discussion about the idea that I think that Joseph just wants to get the Book of Mormon published, but Oliver Cowdery believes that this is the working and the means by which the Church of Christ will come back on the earth again. And at this point in the dictation sequence, right at the very end, Joseph just wants it finished, and so he designates Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer to head up the formation of the church. This is found in Doctrine and Covenants section 18, and this is actually what happens. David Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery, a number of the first elders of the church go and preach immediately, and we know from David Whitmer's address to all believers that they're doing baptizing, they're preaching. Christian Whitmer has copied down some of the text from the Book of Mormon so they can do this, and they're going out and they convert people, in which case there becomes 3 branches of the church, one in Manchester, one in Fayette, and also one in Colesville. But at this very beginning of the church, in June of 1829, Oliver Cowdery gets a revelation for some structure to this church. It's called the Articles and Covenants, and because of some other instances which we've talked about already, but just in short, this Articles and Covenants gets reworked by Joseph Smith in April of 1830 and gets converted into what we now know as Doctrine and Covenants section 20. But in June of 1829, Oliver gets this revelation, and this revelation is supposedly penned by him because it has his kind of express understanding, but it directs the idea that God, and particularly Jesus, is speaking directly to him. But this is a bit of a problem, because when you take Oliver's revelation from June of 1829 and you put it side by side passages from the scriptures, particularly the Doctrine and Covenants, the Book of Mormon, and even the Bible, you find that Oliver is just borrowing whole chunks from somewhere else. Here's the side-by-side with the revelation on the left and the various passages that I've found that collate exactly on the right. First off, Oliver quotes Doctrine and Covenants section 18, word for word, parts of it at least, and then next he quotes 3 Nephi chapter 11. Then he quotes a passage from Moroni chapter 3, and here you can see from the different colours that I've given it that he's used one part of it and then a second part of it, and they're out of order. Next, he quotes from Moroni chapter 4 and then Doctrine and Covenants section 18. There's a line from Moroni chapter 6 and then a whole lot from Moroni chapter 4. And then you can see there's massive amounts quoted from Moroni chapter 5 and then 3 Nephi chapter 18. There's some other parts of 3 Nephi 18, and then also a passage from 3 Nephi chapter 27. He then goes back to Doctrine and Covenants section 18. He uses a line from Doctrine and Covenants section 17, and then Doctrine and Covenants 6, before going back to Doctrine and Covenants 18. And then oddly, he uses Ether chapter 5, which we've just been talking about. He then uses a passage from Moroni chapter 9, which he condenses. And then he uses a statement from Jeremiah chapter 20. And this finishes his Articles and Covenants revelation that he says he gets directly from Jesus. Now, there are a ton of questions to all of this. For instance, Oliver Cowdery is simply cutting and pasting, plagiarizing from the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and also a passage from Jeremiah in the Old Testament. Why does he think that this is okay? Because effectively at the beginning and ending of the whole passage, he's saying this is directly coming from Jesus, yet he's absolutely lifting from the scriptures in some way, form, or another. In fact, there's just so little of it that is in words that he might have actually expressed. Has Joseph taught him that this is the way you get revelation, that you study the scriptures and you cut and paste the scriptures, because that's what a whole lot of the Book of Mormon is? Or is this Oliver Cowdery's first go at getting revelation and he just sucks at it? Or has he figured out that that's the way that Joseph Smith is getting a lot of the Doctrine and Covenants revelations, and so he's just mimicking his style? So many questions that I have that I just don't know the answer to. So if you have any ideas, let me know. Feeling that you're missing something fundamental when it comes to Mormonism. I feel that way all the time, and particularly as I'm looking at the text of the Book of Mormon and the early Doctrine and Covenants, there are just some little things that are odd and seem out of place and that don't describe what I think is happening. When we talked about Ether 5 verses 1 and 2, where Moroni addresses Joseph Smith directly and gives him a command from the past, and the idea that this is more like a revelation in the present, and at this point in Joseph's life And in the dictation sequence of the Book of Mormon, he separated quite entirely the idea of revelation and the text of the Book of Mormon, so that something that is in the present and something that is in the past that's being revealed. But the idea of breaking the fourth wall, or the author addressing the reader, and in this particular instance, addressing the translator, is a really interesting one for the idea of, well, what is going on in Joseph's head? One of the clues might be the earliest revelation we have, which is now designated Doctrine and Covenants section 3. This is the lost manuscript that Martin Harris had taken home to Palmyra and had disappeared. Now, this voice that is coming through the Urim and Thummim is berating Joseph about his lack of judgment, but that the work is godly and God's purposes are going to come forth regardless of the fact that Joseph has transgressed in some way by not really adhering to his director, his seer stone, his voice that is coming through this rock. Joseph gets a stern talking to, the idea that he needs to put himself into the right headspace in order for this to come forward, because he's been given a strict commandment and he needs to adhere to it. This reference to God in the third person suggests that it's somebody talking about God, not God talking. And I think at this stage, Joseph is imagining this as the treasure guardian who is angry at Joseph for not fulfilling the commands. And so Joseph has to go through this dark night of the soul, this racking of torment, because he hasn't fulfilled the requirement. And this seems to mirror earlier understandings of the treasure guardian, that Joseph is struck, he's pressured, he's berated. This is a very violent act of submission that Joseph needs to get in line, that he's broken the most sacred promises. And one of the lines in verse 15 is that he's suffered the counsel of his director to be trampled on from the beginning. Now, the directors at this point is the seer stone. It is what is deemed later to be the Urim and Thummim, and that we see at the beginning of the section. The stone is everything. It's medium between Joseph and the treasure guardian. And this revelation stipulates that the Nephites and the Lamanites and all of the other tribes associated with them, their testimony needs to come forward to the world. The next revelation that Joseph records is in February of 1829 to his father, which is pretty sparse, very small, doesn't really say a great deal except directs his father for missionary work. And then we see in Doctrine and Covenants section 5, which is March of 1829, this whole treatise to Martin Harris in the voice of Jesus, who directs them. So there's a transition there from this July passage through to this March revelation, where the voice goes from the treasure guardian in the third person talking about God to God as Jesus revealing himself to Joseph and his will. This is a transition that I don't think we give enough credit to. The idea that we've gone from a treasure guardian that Joseph has envisioned in his seer stone and got a vision of talking to him, and maybe some form of communication in that regard. And then we see in 1828 in July, we've got this rebuke from the treasure guardian. And then we see that voice morph by early 1829 into the voice of God. While at the same time we had the Book of Mormon voices, the prophets speaking about the tribes, the Nephites and the Lamanites, and their connection to God. And then by the end of the text, voices like Moroni breaking the fourth wall to their reader and also directing Joseph singularly from the past. Joseph's seer stone is transversing time and space and making the heavenly realm connect with the physical present, while also incorporating the ancient past. And all of these voices are converging into deity that Joseph is experiencing as another realm. He's effectively an oracle. And this is how his household, his scribes, those who are around listening to what he's producing, both through Revelation and through the text of the Book of Mormon, through the rock in the hat, they're experiencing him as deity on their behalf. It feels miraculous to everybody involved, including Joseph. And it's powerful because Joseph is conjuring this understanding into reality. So the next time you read the text of the Book of Mormon or these revelations, see what is happening to you as the text conjures up imagery or understandings that feel very esoteric into the present reality. Is this the reason it becomes so compelling to the people who are involved in it? We've talked a lot about how the Book of Mormon borrows from the Bible, particularly King James Version of the Bible, and that many passages have been worked into various stories in the Book of Mormon, large sermons in the Book of Mormon, and then also grabbed together for different aspects or different compilations within the text of the Book of Mormon. But I want to also show you that Joseph does this with the Doctrine and Covenants revelations. Here is Doctrine and Covenants section 4, which is one of the earliest revelations we have. It's from Joseph Smith to his father in February of 1829. So this is before the Book of Mormon is being redictated in Harmony, Pennsylvania with Oliver Cowdery. And I've done a side-by-side with Doctrine and Covenants section 4 and various passages out of the New Testament. Doctrine and Covenants section 4 is only very short. It's just a few verses long, but it borrows extensively from New Testament passages, and they are throughout the New Testament. Let's have a look. So I've used the 1833 Book of Commandments version here because it's slightly different than the one we have that was corrected in 1835, and you'll see why in a second. But look at these things here. Your heart, mind, and strength. That comes from a passage in Mark chapter 12. That ye may stand blameless before God at the last day. That comes from 1 Corinthians 1. The field is white, already to harvest. That comes from John 4. Thrust in your sickle. That comes from Revelations 14. Bringeth salvation. That comes from Titus 2. Faith, hope, and charity. That comes from 1 Corinthians 12. I single comes from Matthew 6. Temperance, patience, and diligence all come from 2 Peter 1, and this is corrected in the 1835 version to include all of those other things that that passage in 2 Peter has, including faith, virtue, knowledge, temperance, patience, brotherly kindness. These are not all the things that are included in the original Doctrine and Covenants section 4. And ask that you shall receive, and knock that it shall be opened. That's Matthew 7. So this is quite impressive in the understanding that Doctrine and Covenants section 4 borrows heavily from the New Testament, but all over the New Testament. Mark, John, Revelations, Titus, Corinthians, Peter, Matthew. This is a huge section of the New Testament, and yet it's being used in these phrases, these idioms, these understandings that make their way into this revelation. And these are the kinds of things that we see in the Book of Mormon as well. Lots of these great compilations of little bits of New Testament, particularly some Old Testament, that go into making a greater understanding. And this is something that we know Joseph does later in his letters to the Colesville branch, both in August and in December of 1830. Now, I've shown this before, but when you put Doctrine and Covenants section 4 up against Doctrine and Covenants section 6, you can see that various things have been borrowed from Doctrine and Covenants section 4 to lay out an understanding of Doctrine and Covenants section 6. And then this understanding in Doctrine and Covenants 6 is used again in Doctrine and Covenants section 11. And a shorter version is used in Doctrine and Covenants section 12 and Doctrine and Covenants section 14. This is pretty impressive, but it also shows an evolution of the ways in which Joseph is constructing Revelation, which he's also doing at exactly the same time as he's producing the Book of Mormon. So these kinds of evolutions are happening within the Book of Mormon, because all of these revelations that I've shown you are through this period of February through to June of 1829, which also dovetails with the production of the Book of Mormon, which is basically March, April of 1829 through to June of 1829. which goes to some earlier understandings that we've been talking about, is that these two projects are the same project. They're just being delimited, either a revelation or writing from the past, which is the Book of Mormon, but they're happening in parallel in the same kinds of ways with the same person. These to me are really big tells that this is Joseph doing this, not anybody else. And then when we see Oliver Cowdery do it with his Articles and Covenants in June of 1829, he's actually just reiterating the kind of process that he's seen Joseph do to produce scripture. It is both fascinating and also a little humbling that it's just this easy to make people believe in these things as divine revelation, that it's coming from God, that it's moving through this, even when those people have been immersed in the biblical culture. And so they probably recognize all of these types of phrases from the Bible that are being reworked, both in the Book of Mormon and in the Doctrine and Covenants, and yet they still feel incredibly attached to it as new revelation, as new scripture. Adding to the idea that Joseph reworked large parts of the Bible into works that he was doing, including the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, is the understanding that he did the same when he started working on the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible in June of 1830. In the Mosiah Priority of the Book of Mormon, in the replacement text that was done at the Whitmer farm, and some of that anti-Catholic material, there is an understanding that the Great and Abominable Church took out plain and precious parts from the Bible, and Joseph had the idea to restore these in a Joseph Smith translation edition of the Bible. Basically, it was a new Bible commentary, and these were incredibly popular at the time, including one by Adam Clarke that was being used extensively, and which we can show was used to create some of the passages in the Book of Mormon and the reworking of the biblical material that's there. But the first part of this Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, which includes a reworking of Genesis, is canonized as the Book of Moses in the Pearl of Great Price. Chapters 2 and 3 of Moses mirror the information that is in Genesis 1 and 2. And I've done a side-by-side so you can see them here. And you can see that Genesis 1 is being produced almost in entirety, and it's been reworked in Moses chapter 2 with some additional information. The biggest change to the text is that the Genesis version is in the third person, and the Moses version is in the first person. So it says, I, God, in the Moses account. But it generally uses the same phrasing and quotes and language as the King James Version text of Genesis 1 and then 2. There are a few extended understandings that are added to the Moses version, but it's pretty much exactly the same till it comes to the idea that the gods did things in the Genesis creation story, and there Joseph puts into the Joseph Smith translation the understanding that the only begotten was next to God as these creation events took place. And then when we get to Genesis chapter 2, which is another version of the creation story, which is accounted for in the biblical tradition with the document hypothesis. But in this case, Joseph reworks the text to be able to give an understanding that things were created spiritually before they were created naturally. And that's why you have these two accounts. And although Genesis chapter 2 is completely redone in Moses chapter 3, there are these new understandings of an spiritual process prior to these natural events. And then this ends with a complete copy of the Genesis text into Moses chapter 3. And it's worthy of noting that Moses as a entity, as a new revelation or new scripture, has 7 chapters, and 2 of them are basically incredible repeats from Genesis and just reworking that same material. And the kind of way that Genesis is reworked in these chapters of Moses is the same way that we have seen passages and chapters of the Bible included in the Book of Mormon. Here's a recap of Matthew chapter 5, which is 3 Nephi chapter 12 in the Book of Mormon. And you can see these reworkings of understandings and then new passages added in with different understandings for the reworking of this Matthew material for 3 Nephi. And so the Book of Moses, particularly in these 2 chapters, are just reworking biblical narratives almost exactly. And this is pretty much what the Joseph Smith translation is in its entirety, but there are parts of it which have been reworked, and this Moses part is particularly different, or at least in the other chapters of Moses are different, that they've been included in the Pearl of Great Price as a separate entity. And like I said before, this was first done in June of 1830 with John Whitmer as the scribe, and this was long before Joseph met Sidney Rigdon in November-December of that year. So the kind of style that we see of the Book of Mormon borrowing stuff from the Bible is exactly the same kind of style that we see Moses borrowing information and text and passages and even whole chapters of Genesis. Now you may have the question, what is the relationship between the Book of Mormon and the Book of Moses? Joseph worked on both of these projects only a year apart. The Book of Mormon was completed around June of 1829, and the Book of Moses was done during June of 1830. The Book of Moses is just the beginning part of Joseph's retranslation of the Bible, and it just has some unique things to it that were more revelatory, and so it was put as a separate section in the Pearl of Great Price in 1853 and then canonized by 1889. But it borrows extensively from the Book of Mormon. There are a number of passages which are unique to the Book of Mormon that show up in the Book of Moses that don't appear in the Bible, and there is whole papers on this. You can go and read the phrases that show up, in which case many apologists use this to suggest that the Book of Moses text was actually on the brass plates, and that's why it ended up in the Book of Mormon and why it then ended up in the Book of Moses that Joseph translated, or his new kind of reworking of the Bible later in 1830. I think the more simpler explanation is that Joseph is doing this right after the Book of Mormon, and so he's got a lot of phrases in his head that he then repeats, including a number of storylines and understandings. And there are a few of these that come into the Book of Moses that are definitely not in the Bible, like the understanding of the secret combinations that become a big theme in the Book of Mormon, and which are reiterated in sometimes unique ways in the Book of Moses. And some of these passages you can do as a bit of a side-by-side. They're not as tight as the other examples that I have shown you, but it still gives you a good idea. And this one is from Ether 8 and comparing it to Moses 5, and you see a number of phrases that are being reused in a very similar order around the idea of these secret combinations coming forth. And here's another example in Alma chapter 12, which is many of the same phrases that are being used in Moses chapter 4 and some of the same kinds of understandings. And here's the side-by-side. Joseph's follow-up project to create a new translation of the Bible and to restore some lost things that he believed had been taken away by the Great and Abominable Church came into some problems really early on. One is that Joseph ended up with some persecution in July of 1830, and so he basically decided to leave Harmony, Pennsylvania, and go through to New York. And then later that year, he met Sidney Rigdon, and he ended up going to Ohio with Sidney and relocating the membership there, in which case Sidney Rigdon became his scribe, and they worked on this new translation of the Bible throughout the next couple of years through to 1833. The project was almost complete and was slated to be the next thing to be printed after the Book of Commandments, but the printing press in Jackson County, Missouri was destroyed and the saints were evicted out of that area, and so the Book of Commandments was never quite finished, and therefore the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible was also not printed. Joseph reworked the material in the Book of Commandments and changed many of those revelations to be the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. And that was the next thing to be printed. And by the time that was finished, the Joseph Smith translation, which was much earlier than all of these changes and iterations and theological developments, that it became kind of irrelevant for Joseph to produce. He then moved on to the Book of Abraham in 1836, and those understandings, also fueled by the fact that he went to Hebrew school, changed the whole nature, and the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible was shelved. Joseph produced a new beginning of creation, a creation story, a Genesis reworking with regard to Abraham in the Book of Abraham, and that superseded what was done in the Joseph Smith translation, and even superseded what was done in Moses. And just for clarification, Joseph went on to do new projects, new theological developments, and he based that on the Bible and not on his Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible, because there were many passages in the Bible that gave him more clarification, and his Joseph Smith translation contradicted those, and so he never really used the Joseph Smith translation as a work of scripture, and so neither did the membership of the church.